Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I see a whole bunch of names and black screens, but I have total confidence that you are there, lunch or not lunch in hand, and fully prepared to have an hour or so of information about accessory dwelling units. I know that this topic is something that has been discussed for many years here in Ithaca, and there was an ordinance that was passed, I think, in 2020. I did want to have this presentation, though, because it has been a topic of great discussion at the state this year, with a great thank you to my assembly member colleague, Harvey Epstein, who has been working on a bill on this legislation. I read this bill very carefully, and the longer I read it, the more excited I got, because not only is it very focused on small scale incremental development in neighborhoods, providing that option instead of, massive, huge, large scale buildings. But it also addressed a lot of the specific concerns that have been raised by local residents here in Tompkins County, which I was very careful to note as I went through. So the longer I read it, the more excited I got. And I wanted to make sure that everyone here is educated about the efforts that are happening at the state, the bill that's being considered, and also have a long discussion with our dear friends at the AARP and the Regional Plan Association to help us understand what the state of housing is in New York, as well as the role that ADUs can play specifically with the desire to age in place of many people in our communities. We'll open with a Q&A after that, including our very own Rob Cantelmo, Alderperson from Fall Creek, Alex Lawson from Housing Policy, who's the Housing Policy Coordinator at CNY Fair Housing. And I will introduce all of the presenters as they come up. So I wanted to pass this over to my dear friend, ally, advocate, champion, human rights champion, Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, to introduce his ADU bill.
Well, first of all, Assemblymember Kelles, thank you for everything you do in Albany. You've been a staunch supporter of social and economic justice, and it's really, Ithaca should be proud to have you as their representative. You've been not just a friend and a colleague, but a real motivator, a movement maker. You've brought issues to light that people didn't understand and gotten so much attention to it. So thank you for doing that. Absolutely. And thank you for inviting me to talk about ADUs as well. Accessory dwelling units is something that I've been working on for, I don't want to say maybe how long, but maybe 15 or 20 years at this point, and trying to figure out a pathway forward, knowing where I represent and I live in New York City, for people who want to know. And this is an issue not just affects people in places like Ithaca, but affects people like New York City as well. And all across the state, we've had one, issues of illegal ADUs, two, the need for affordable housing, and three, a real plan to create that affordable housing. And it can't all just be large, 100-unit buildings or 500-unit buildings. It's got to be a comprehensive approach to affordable housing. And what we saw happen in last year, where 11 people from New York City died in illegal ADUs, we needed to create a pathway to legalization. So Senator Harcum and I have been working on this legislation with a strong advocacy group, including the Regional Plan Association, who I see is here, as well as AARP, and saying, what are we going to do around this? And we created a comprehensive piece of legislation. One, knowing that we have to be careful of, sewage and septic issues, and really taking that into account is a critical factor in any kind of ADU legislation. Two is making sure this is real affordable housing and long-term affordable housing. It isn't for short-term rentals. It's not for an Airbnb. It's not, for just, this is housing where people will live and stay. I know in Ithaca, it's an issue to disclose, I guess, and I should disclose that I spent 4 years of my life in Ithaca as a Ithaca College alum. I understand the struggles of people who go to Ithaca, New York to live, and people go to Ithaca, New York for school. And this is not a pathway to throw 20 Ithaca or Cornell students in a house and pretend that it's an ADU. This is a reality of how do we get affordable housing? How do we make sure that it's for people who own and occupy their buildings to create this second unit, this ADU unit, and to ensure that these are not going to be these spaces that don't add to the community, don't add housing that people really need. So those are fundamental tenets of this bill. And, we had a real strong pathway here. Just to be honest with folks, there was a lot of pushback. We saw a lot of pushback on Long Island, even though Assemblymember Ramos was a staunch supporter of it. The governor felt like, in the context of the budget in January this year, she proposed a comprehensive ADU bill in the budget. Last week, she unfortunately decided to pull it out of the budget and to have larger conversations. And the idea is that we need, and she acknowledges that we need, a comprehensive ADU reform in our state. It's an environmentally sound way to build housing. It's an environmentally sound way to not have to worry about, potential risks across our planet. It's something that's a way to bring resources to homeowners. It increases property values for the homeowners. There's a lot of wins here, but because of the large pushback, she felt like we needed to take a step back. In the Assembly, while we are pushing forward on this legislation, we're also creating working groups, and Assemblymember Kelles is a part of a working group to really dig in deep and talk through what the issues are. So my goal here is to be supportive of whatever, and to hear back when Assemblymember Kelles has been open and honest about the needs of her constituents. And I'm just happy to be here to lend my support and to be available in the future when Assemblymember Kelles and our constituents have questions. So Anna, thank you for letting me join you, and thank you for letting me speak for a few minutes at this event.
Thank you so much, Harvey. And really, I do want to thank you for addressing concerns that you were hearing across the state and the fears, particularly across the state. I know that this piece of legislation that you have created would prevent the use of ADUs for short-term rentals. It is, at this time, it would require homeowner, primary dwelling, the homeowner live on the property. That was also another concern. And you also have language in there specifically about environmental considerations. So both health and environment. And those are some of the biggest concerns that I've heard in this area. So, those are all the reasons that I support this legislation. And I just wanted to thank you again for being so conscientious and thorough and scientific about your process of addressing both concerns and creating something that will truly, truly increase affordable housing that we need so much. So thank you so much. And I will continue to champion this with you in all the ways that we can to make this happen.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you. And I look forward to hearing from Regional Plan and AARP on their issues and their leadership here. They've been really amazing partners in this campaign.
And just one last thing, the idea is that it would create sort of a baseline zoning code for the whole state that the local municipalities could build off of. It may ultimately be that we create model ordinances for local municipalities to pick from, but that is still under discussion. I think the most important thing is that there are a lot of municipalities that don't have the expertise or bandwidth to really do all of the digging and research on how to create an ordinance that really works for their municipality. So getting that expertise at the state level and creating that baseline, I think, is very important. So so that's the last important piece of the legislation that I just wanted to make sure everyone here is aware of, and then turn it over to our first presenter, Kristen McManus.
One quick thing, did you mention that, Anna? There's also going to be resources for municipalities as well. The governor put $85 million in the budget. Some of that money can be earmarked towards municipalities so they can help with creating ADU ordinances and capacity to oversee the system as well.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things we're always talking about is unfunded mandates, and this can't be one of them. So absolutely. Thank you so much, Harvey. So I know you have to run. I'd love it. Stay as long as you can, chime in wherever you see fit. And as I mentioned, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen McManus. She is the Associate State Director of AARP New York, and she's going to speak on the benefits of the ADU bill for seniors specifically, and talk about ADUs and aging in place. So I know Kristen, I'm sorry, you have a presentation. Do you have the ability to, I think, Jen, to turn it over to you to load your presentation?
I should.
Wonderful.
Hopefully you can all see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry, it takes a few minutes for this to load up, but thank you, Assemblymember Kelles, for hosting this, and thank you, Assemblymember Epstein, for your strong leadership on this issue. It's really great to be able to join you all here today, and I see some old AARP friends have joined also, so it's nice to be able to reunite. So I'm going to be joined today by my colleague Samar, who's in our national office, to give a little bit of the national perspective. But right now I'm just going to focus a little bit on what we find when we speak to older adults about accessory dwelling units. So AARP in 2021 updated our home and community preferences survey, where we talk to older adults and see, where they think they're going to live, how they want to age, and where they want to age. And you can see from these results here that there's a significant amount of people who believe that they will have to move to enable them to age independently. They may need to leave their current home, that they would consider leaving their community if they find one that is safer. But I think there's also a hesitance for people to leave the communities that they essentially helped build, that they have lived in for decades. When we ask folks about sharing a home, almost 70% say they would consider sharing a home, but most of that is among family and friends, which I think makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the great reasons why we support accessory dwelling units. For us, this is about keeping families together, keeping family members close to each other, so they can provide the care that they need, or be nearby to allow them to better age independently. So I want to just take a moment here and kind of visualize what an ADU can look like, right? So we have detached ADUs, which are a separate unit that's on the same property, or you can convert part of your home either as a basement or a garage conversion, or something that's already attached to your home that you just fit into an independent living space. But I think one of the great benefits about ADUs, as you can see in a lot of these examples, is it's a great and easy way to really incorporate inclusive design and universal design principles. You can very easily make an accessory dwelling unit, have no step entry, have very wide hallways, wide entranceways that can really enable people to live as they age, enable the use of either a wheelchair or a walker. If somebody will need that, you can easily install grab bars. And we know that it's much easier to do this from the get-go than to go back and retrofit to allow for this. So that's another great thing about ADUs. They allow the independent living space that can truly help people age in place. So when we talk to the 50 plus, and we ask them about accessory dwelling units, whether or not they would consider living in one, what we found from our survey is that nearly 60% say they would consider moving into an ADU. And most of those are because they want to have their own space and remain independent, but people do not want to age in nursing homes. And this is a great way to allow people to stay in their communities independently, but near a caregiver. They can have support doing their daily activities, or for some people, they just want to be able to downsize from the family home that they've been living in and move into a smaller space and save some money. And then when we ask our the 50 plus about creating an accessory dwelling unit, for the most part, this is very popular. Nearly 3/4 of the people that we polled say that they would consider creating an ADU, either as a place for their caregiver to stay or as a place for the person that they are caring for to stay. Also to just provide housing for relatives and friends regardless of their care needs. I think we hear this a lot from older adults that have grandchildren that they want to be able to keep nearby, but the cost of housing and the cost of renting is way too expensive to allow younger people to continue to stay in the areas where they grew up. And this is another way to enable that. So we see this as a very popular idea among the 50 plus. And when we talk about older adults and accessory dwelling units, really the greatest benefits, as I said, are to create an independent living space to allow people to care for their loved ones, whether they want to downsize or perhaps create one and then get an extra source of income through the rentals. It also increases affordable housing options in a neighborhood by creating these accessory dwelling units. You now have additional rooms that are open for rent. And I think that there are some older adults that we've spoken to that really see this as a way to give back to the community. They know that they live in a high value, desirable area. They want to be able to provide that housing option to, enable more younger people to be able to stay there. And again, like I said, this is intergenerational housing. We can help younger adults stay in the neighborhoods with more affordable housing options, stay there with their families, or, allow caregivers to care for their older loved ones rather than going into a nursing home or an assisted living or other long-term care facility. So as I said, I think this is a great way to create these intergenerational communities and help older adults to age in place. But of course, it's very difficult to do that if accessory dwelling units are not legal statewide. I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague, Samar. And Samar, I can just run the slides for you.
Thank you, Kristen. I just want to firstly thank Assemblymember Kelles to invite us for this presentation, and also the leadership, Assemblymember Epstein, for this legislation and making sure that if we cross the line, and hopefully we will do it going forward. To start with, obviously, Kristen talked about why ADU is important and also gave us a brief introduction on the survey that we do for older adults. I'm just going to talk about what our work has been in terms of advocacy for ADUs. To start with, our advocacy work is in conjunction with our AARP livable communities approach, also known as the age-friendly approach, where we see issues and policies from a holistic purpose. We have a number of resources that, Kristen, next slide. We have a number of resources that work on various aspects of housing and public spaces under the livable communities resources. And it's not on the screen right now, but we actually have the link in the slide which shows.
I'm sorry, Samar, it's just taking a really long time to turn.
Okay, it's yeah, there you go. So as you can see on this slide, technology always does not work when we want it to work. So as you can see on the screen, we have a list of resources when it comes to livable communities. And yes, ADU is a very important enterprise strategy for us, but when we work on public spaces and housing, we have a very holistic approach, and all these publications are public documents which anyone can download and go through it. We also have a list of video series that we have created, and this was created by our consultant, Eli Spivak, who is a developer advocate and has been part of our integral part of our ADU advocacy approach. The link for this video series, which explains what ADUs are and why ADUs are important, are also there in these slides and in the link. The next thing we also have are the ABCs of ADUs, which is a primer for elected officials, policymakers, local leaders, homeowners, consumers, and others. The ABCs of ADUs is an award-winning 20-page introductory and best practice guide for how towns, cities, counties, and states can include ADUs in their mix of housing options. One of the best examples of this document's effectiveness was when, during a ADU legislative campaign in Louisville, Kentucky, we sent printed copies of ABCs of ADUs to all council members. And one of the council members literally put the publication up in the middle of a council hearing and just told us the importance of ABCs and of ADUs. Hopefully, you will have the thing on the slide on the screen so that we can see how it looks like. Yeah, I think Jen just put the link to that. Going through the list of our ADU successes, as Kristen was saying, our work has been, it's not only New York based, but actually ADU work has been going throughout the country. And ADU legislation and advocacy has taken off in different parts of the country. It's not only part of, there you go. It's not only part of East Coast or the West Coast, even the Midwest and the South, there's enough ADU advocacy happening, and there's a lot of traction. To start with, I'll just talk to you about certain successes we have in Des Moines, Iowa, where the Iowa State Office used an age-friendly approach to identify the need for more compact, walkable communities with housing that's more affordable than typical single-family homes. They applied for and secured a 2020 AARP Community Challenge Grant to fund construction of an ADU demonstration project to build awareness and educate lawmakers and residents. More importantly, in 2019, which was the catalyst for more density and allowing zoning changing from single family to multifamily, was in Oregon in HB 2001, which focused on missing middle housing, promoting more density by allowing zoning or duplexes and multi-family housing, including ADUs. As I said, this was an important bill that paved way for Oregon to be one of the states in forefront of ADU advocacy. In fact, Oregon recently, I think last year, passed legislation which specifically targeted ADUs in rural areas. In the spring of 2018, the Division of Aging and Disability Services in Lexington and Fayette County in Kentucky applied for and received a $10,000 AARP Community Challenge Grant to support an ADU design competition. More importantly, the next slide, when it comes up, we'll talk. There you go. We had some really important successes in terms of legislative wins, starting with Connecticut, your New York State's neighbor. This was an important legislative victory because Connecticut historically has not been very forthcoming in terms of doing any layer zoning changes. So it was about time that this legislation was introduced, and we were successful in passing an ADU legislation, which provides ADU by right. Now, again, when we do ADU advocacy, we know that our model ordinance that we have will not get everything on it, but when we do our ADU advocacy, we negotiate and we try to make sure that the ADU legislation is as less restrictive as possible. Similarly, in Louisville Metro Council also passed an amendment to the Land Development Code in Louisville, Kentucky. This was again a very important win because the last time the Land Development Code in Kentucky was amended was in the 1960s. So as you can see, it was about time that they amended the LDC, and they had a lot of segregatory laws still prevailing in the LDC. And in the end, we were successful in passing the legislation. This again, we got ADU by right, and we made sure that, you know, when ADU by right is passed, there's no space for public review or public comments, but at least just ministerial review, which is an easier process to get ADU constructed. In Utah, we were successful in passing HB 82, which allows for single family homes to build ADUs. Now, this is a slightly restrictive ADU legislation, but in the context of ADU advocacy, this was a huge win because Utah, again, was pretty conservative when it comes to zoning legislations. It was tough to pass anything related to ADUs. So this was an important win for us, where we actually assisted our state offices in advocating for ADUs to be passed. This legislation is not by right. It has other restrictive things like owner occupancy and additional parking requirements. But again, in the context of ADU advocacy, this was a good win to at least allow ADU constructions in Utah. Similarly, in Philadelphia, there was a local win where we had where we were successful in passing the legislation to allow ADUs in 4 council districts out of the 10. Again, a big win because I live in Philadelphia. I know zoning changes is not easy in Philadelphia. And this was again a big win where they allowed ADUs in 4 districts, except other than historic structures. So again, a very important win. As we speak, the Philadelphia office is going through an ADU campaign to make sure that this is a citywide legislation. Next slide. All right, as you can see, the ADU advocacy is happening all over the country. This slide shows you the breadth of ADU advocacy that we have, but this is not updated actually. We had a couple of wins from Tucson, Arizona, and in the list we see Maryland, where we talk about Annapolis. It was introduced, it already passed, so we had a great win, local win there also. And as we speak, New Jersey just introduced an ADU legislation, which again will go through our advocacy process. So hopefully we'll have a win there too. In terms of what the challenges that we have, again, we were just talking at the start where ADU financing is an issue. We had the governor allotted $85 million, but that was taken off. However, I think there are other examples which I'm not saying is gold standard, but there are other places like in California has a 20,000 actually provides an ADU grant, has an ADU grant program where they provide $25,000 in assistance to reimburse homeowners for pre-development costs necessary to build an ADU. Again, as I mentioned, this is not a gold standard, but another example of where ADU financing can be used. And if we can allot some funding for that, it will be really great, especially for low-income homeowners. We have also had successes, as I meant, in passing legislation in certain areas where we would like to revisit the legislation and try to see if we can get it less restrictive. One example was Utah, but again, I don't know how successful we may be going back and revisiting the legislation, but we are doing that in certain states. Lastly, the current administration in DC is prioritizing affordable housing and increasing housing options. In a recent fact sheet last year in September, the White House recognized the federal government has a critical role to play in boosting supply for affordable housing and helping state local governments to boost housing supply, including ADUs. We also recently we were invited to be part of the White House webinar on ADUs, where our colleagues actually presented our advocacy work as part of the presentation. And we had other partners who actually we have worked with also be part of the webinar. So you can see how ADUs are being discussed at the national level, and it's not only regional, even though the impact will happen at the regional level, but the national discussion on ADUs has already started. Lastly, we also, I haven't discussed that in the slide, but we also had our CEO Joanne Jenkins do an interview with Marcia Fudge, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, where they discussed the importance of ADUs and boosting housing supplies. I think that's about for me, and thank you so much for inviting me for this webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Samar and Kristen. I think this is very important for us to hear the context that we're working in, to understand that ADUs are being discussed all across the entire country. I think there has been a particular momentum because the generations right now, baby boomers that are going, into the retirement phase of life, at least the ones who I have spoken to, and I've spoken to many, there is a real drive to age in place more than previous generations. And that is really the impetus for this conversation. So to see, one, what is happening across the country, two, to see that one of the groups that is driving the ADU conversation are the seniors in our and elder populations, and as young as the baby boomers, because of course for me, I don't consider baby boomers to be senior, because that means that I'm a few years away from it myself, and it's happening way too fast. And this is my mom, so this is me getting personal for a second. So it's so hard to consider the population in my head and put it in place. But I do come back to my mom, who is exactly that population and is exact mentality of absolutely no interest in leaving her house for the rest of her life. And how do we make that happen? So this is deeply personal. This is in my heart. And to see, lastly, that there are different versions, that this can take different forms, as you've pointed out, that it can be modified is very important. And what's being discussed in New York, again, is about creating a baseline, and every municipality can make it more more broad. So for example, one of the things that's been discussed in our community is the need to create equity in affordable housing, so that we create options for all groups to have access to not just rent, but to own their own home. And part of that discussion has been, do we open it up exclusively for homeowners, or do we open it up more broadly so that people who are renters can become homeowners? So we've had some very robust and wonderful conversations. And again, this is about creating a baseline and then acknowledging the support system. And I know AARP is here for the community to continue to work through what it is that we need that would really promote the affordable housing and allow people to age in place. So thank you so much for all the work that you've brought to us and the work that you've done. I want to turn this over to Marcel Negret. He is a senior planner for the Regional Plan Association, and he provides technical and research expertise to RPA's advocacy efforts, and in particular in the context of housing availability across the states. This is going to give us more of an in-state perspective. I want to thank Marcel so much for coming. I know you have a few slides, and you will be the last presentation before we transition to a robust Q&A, which I know we will have.
Thank you, Assembly Member, for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Negret. I'm a senior planner with the RPA. I'm going to share my screen. If you can confirm if that is coming through. Is it coming through? You should. I see some heads.
Yes,
nodding,
it is.
So, okay,
we're
great.
good.
Just a quick introduction to the RPA. We are a nonprofit research and planning and advocacy organization dedicated to the improvement of the New York metropolitan region. And so it's a big region. There are of course, the 3 states, 31 counties, and almost 800 localities, each with their local zoning authority. Our work is at the intersection of these 4 areas of planning: the transportation, energy and environment, housing, and governance. So we're holistic in nature. And the RPA has been for a long time. Actually, this year we're celebrating our centennial. RPA was instituted in 1922. And every generation or so, so approximately 20-25 years, the RPA issues a regional plan. And so in 2017, the RPA released its 4th regional plan, making a series of recommendations. I think there's a total of 64 recommendations that are grounded in these 4 values: equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. And one core area, and there's about a dozen recommendations that have to do with affordable communities and housing. And so one of them in particular was talking about the ideas of accessory dwelling units. But the main reasoning there is realizing the depth of housing cost burden that is affecting renters and homeowners alike. So just to show some specific figures to New York State, we can see that there's almost 3 million households that are considered to be housing cost burden, meaning that they're paying 30% or more of their monthly income towards housing related expenses. And so that could be rent, but it could also be a mortgage or just overall maintenance to their house. So that represents about 40% of all households in the state. And these conditions affect mostly, or affect in a disproportionate way, seniors, people of color, and younger people more than the rest. I would also highlight that according to the latest version of the Census Pulse Survey, about 38% of all households, which is about 630,000 households in the state, are at high risk of eviction or foreclosure. And this is all related to housing scarcity and how our region has been unable to meet the demand, really, and address the constraints in terms of housing supply. So in regards to that, the RPA has issued a number of reports that talk about various types of housing. This report is in particular highlighting transit-oriented development, but more relevant to this discussion and to Ithaca is the idea of accessory dwelling units. So back in 2020, we issued a specific report that elaborated on this concept entitled "Be My Neighbor." And so I think one impetus for this, and just to summarize a little bit of the thinking here, summarizing this meme, is that single unit zoning or single family zoning is really a cookie cutter approach that hinders the diversity of land uses, housing types, people, and mobility options. And so instead of creating diverse walkable communities, single family zoning has created segregated car dependent communities. And of course, being car dependent, it's also bad for the environment. So this meme speaks to the values and inspiration behind the report, and this distills the idea that these zoning barriers have become obstacles for not only economic potential, but for advancing the values and the sense of community development that was promoted by the famous TV character, a TV series hosted by Mr. Rogers. So just stepping a little bit back into history and what were the policies or the accumulation of policy decisions rather that were made over multiple generations that led to this. I think we have to go back all the way to mid 20th century and the aftermath of the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration that implemented the first type of housing programs that really enabled this type of zoning throughout the US, the region, and in New York State. And so as a requirement for many home refinancing assistance programs, there was this requirement of having in place type of zones, single family zoning that prevented basically housing diversity. This is an issue that has been very well articulated, perhaps most known, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And so indeed, these type of patterns have prevailed even into the 21st century. So we did examine the housing stock for each of the 782 municipalities in our region that have control over their land use, and compare that against the housing stock of that's provided in the form of single family detached units. And so in this tabulated chart, you could see how the correlation that exists between income, ownership, and race and ethnicity in terms of the prevalence of single family, single unit zoning and housing. And so the first part just shows that in municipalities where more than 90% of the housing stock is provided in the form of single family detached units, the percent of white population is about 86%, while the Black and Latinx population is less than 2 and 6%. But as my colleagues Samar and Kristen mentioned, it's also an important issue for aging in place. And so if we look at the population within the state, there's approximately 3.3 million seniors living in the state. And about 1 million of them are considered the primary householder and living alone. So there's about 1 million seniors that are the primary householder of that housing unit and are living alone. So they're either a widow or divorced, I guess. So I guess a good example of that type of category would be the empty nester who's living alone with no spouse. And then also a third of all households in the state have one or more senior in their household. So the example of that would be a family living with their grandparents. So that's just to show that at the state level, there is the demand for increasing housing choice and housing types. And so this is where we think ADUs come in and are a very important way to address these issues. Here's a typology that was inspired, a graphic that was inspired by some of the AARP reports The first row of illustration shows extensions of the building envelope, or expanding the footprint of the building to create a detached, attached, or even an extension above the garage to provide for an ADU. But it also could also be constrained to the existing envelope of the building, or the existing building footprint. And so that's the row on the lower bottom, showing like you'd also convert the existing space from your basement, from your attic, or your garage to come up with an ADU. So at a scale, in a neighborhood scale, that this could really make a difference. Here's some examples that are specific to our region. Here's some existing examples in Westchester County. Here's a couple from Connecticut. As Samar mentioned, we also were deeply involved in the process in Connecticut, and as well as in New Jersey. And here on the right is an example in Queens. So like the ranges of typologies is really wide. We also looked at some of the potential numbers of the long term, whether these policies were adopted at the state level, what were the implications, and these projections are really over several decades. So the projection year is 2040. So any amount of these units that could be produced, it's really over the long term. And one thing that we also highlighted in these reports was we examined a couple of local ordinances, and we saw that how inconsistent they are among them. And so that really becomes a barrier to financing and scalability. And one thing that you need to have having ADUs really becoming a tangible option is for them to have some consistency throughout. But if you have this patchwork of regulations, it makes it very hard to access some of the financing options and the type of services that will be needed in terms of design, architectural services that will be needed to offer to make this option a reality. And as Samar mentioned, this is something that's being under development at the national level. Just last year, the White House mandated its Federal Housing Finance Agency mandating Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to facilitate financing to ADUs, to the construction of ADUs. And one important thing to highlight here is that the ability to use future expected rent as an income and include that part as part of the underwriting process is something that is crucial for ADUs. But so that speaks to the need for having more flexibility in terms of the occupancy requirements. But currently, many New Yorkers are not able to access these new financing mechanisms that are now being available at the national level because of these local zoning and inconsistent regulations. And so that's another reasoning for having a state framework that would facilitate some of this. So in those reports, we highlighted 4 buckets of recommendations. First and foremost, the importance of having state legislation that incentivizes like this consistency and encouraging the policies that need to be implemented at a local level. Even with or without a state framework, there needs to be an updated sets of zoning requirements. This also includes parking requirements, which I think Samar alluded to. Parking standards can make or break ADUs. And so instead of requiring off-street parking requirements, you could better manage on-street parking regulations, for example. And then finally is that the type of assistance that should be available, and another reason for why the state should be proactive in facilitating a framework in terms of assistance for technical information, connecting homeowners with a list of vetted suppliers of architects and designers, but also the financing aspect that I think is really important. Not just setting up new programs entirely focusing seniors or low and moderate income homeowners, but also allowing for the private sector and the programs that could be available through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as I alluded earlier. I'll post a few references in the chat, but I think that concludes my part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Marcel. And I think, one of the core things that you brought up that is so important is, why are we having this discussion at the state level? People think of zoning as, the central right and purview of local governments. And, one of the things that I've learned in this process at the state level is that it is a constant active dialogue, and that the state has always been very involved in zoning and establishing standards. I learned recently that, for example, the state has a law that regulates the height of grass on people's lawns. That is at the state level, for example, to create a standard across the state. How that one got in, I don't fully know, but it does make the point that we have always been highly engaged in zoning. Building code, of course, comes from the state level. And the most important thing, that you did point out is the inconsistency, the magnitude of the inconsistency across municipalities in and of itself hinders the ability for municipalities to finance the ADUs, and having some kind of baseline standard across the state will really establish that. I think it's also really important to note that that this is an equity issue. I do want to thank our participant Esther. I put a link in the chat of a link that she shared with me specifically on how to create full community engagement in establishing the built environment, so that there is buy-in and joint participation. There are other links in the chat, so please do look that up. The wonderful book that Marcel mentioned, The Color of Law, highly recommend it. I have not finished it. It is dense. I have read parts, but it is profound and amazing, and an incredible explanation of our history. And lastly, the uncomfortable conversation of exclusionary zoning and its history and where it came from is really important. I've had conversations, there is sort of an innate visceral fear that if we ban exclusionary zoning or single family zoning, that it will automatically lead to an explosion of development across the entire area. But that's actually not what the data shows. By lifting that restriction, it predominantly leads to the development of duplexes up to quadplexes, because those are affordable. Once you get beyond quadplexes, you have to have a commercial loan for the development, and you have to incorporate much more expensive materials for development. So those are things worth discussing, but thank you so much for bringing all of these up. And I do want to open it up for discussion with our entire planet. We are recording this, so maybe this will be for the entire planet eventually. But I do want to specifically again welcome Rob Cantelmo, the Alderperson, new as of this year, but incredibly educated. This is his field. This is his life. He is finishing his PhD in government at Cornell. Has worked in this area for many years. And also Alex Lawson, the Housing Policy Coordinator for CNY Fair Housing. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Kelles. Also want to thank Assemblymember Epstein, Kristen, Samar, Marcel, and all the audience participants. I want to just quickly reiterate a couple of these benefits. Can
you speak closer to your mic? I want to make sure we catch every word.
Yep. Better? Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to reiterate the benefits that were discussed, I think, with a lens towards their compatibility, in my mind, with a lot of the home rule considerations that come up when discussing something like this at the state level, right? I think, it's been clear Ithaca needs critical housing stock growth, and I think ADUs, as our panel kind of discussed, provide an opportunity to do this in a way that helps to retain the existing built environment in a community. I also think that, you know, the potential income for low and moderate and fixed income folks really benefits their ability to offset the perennial Tompkins County challenge of rising property taxes. I also want to just emphasize, right, that the bill in consideration has state lending opportunities for low and moderate income residents, you know, that help provide for ADU development, design, construction, and something very particularly salient to my community, my constituency, also mitigating flood risk and flood prevention. Right, we all are aware of those new FEMA maps. We're all aware of the challenges that are faced in the flats of Ithaca. And, you know, being able to leverage this with our concerns about climate change, I think is one promising externality for exploring ADUs. I also want to just say, again, from the perspective of this is the state setting a baseline, right? I've read through this bill, and I've also read through the proposals that were going around in Ithaca in 2020. Everything in this bill is compatible with the proposal under discussion in 2020. And this is key. It's allowing us to retain, as a municipality, control over the issues that are our biggest concerns. So, as was mentioned by Assemblymember Epstein, right, the bill permits for owner-occupied requirements at the local level. We will also, as per the bill, you know, retain the right to regulate them with respect to short-term rentals. Those are not policies that are being set by Albany at the state level, right? They're done locally and with sensitivity to our community concerns. So just a couple of things I want to say, you know, thank you again for inviting me to be here today, and yeah, happy to be part of the.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate it. Rob, which I think you prefer, but is what I'm used to. So I do want to point out a data point that was just added by Marcel in the chat. There are about 4,000 senior householders living alone just in Tompkins County. Of course, this district is larger. We have Tompkins County and Cortland County. That's a couple thousand more in Cortland County. So this is a relatively large population that we are talking about. And I do want to mention one last thing that hasn't been brought up, and then I want to open it up to questions. So please do add any questions to the chat. I am monitoring that. I have one already, which I will share next. But what I appreciate about accessory dwelling units is that this is small scale infill development, which means that you know, that we everyday people, not necessarily, we don't have to be developers in order to be able to add an accessory dwelling unit. What often happens when accessory dwelling units are prevented, meaning there's an ordinance that prevents them, or there's an ordinance that is so restrictive that in effect it prevents them from being built in the community, then the community has to rely exclusively on the large scale developers to build large scale massive housing developments. Which means that then the wealthier developers are the ones who benefit because they are almost exclusively, if not exclusively, rentals, not homeowner options. They are often seeking and are able to get you know, state funding support as subsidies because they are providing affordable housing. And you know, they're large scale, so they can create segregation within a community. So for all of those reasons, I am particularly very interested in accessory dwelling units. So I just wanted to add that. And then I have a question from Teresa Alt. Does the bill that has been introduced by Assemblymember Epstein and Senator Harckham limit use of accessory dwelling units to relatives and caregivers? No, it does not. If so, how can the house later be sold? So no, it does not. It simply requires that to be used as an accessory dwelling unit, to be rented out or to be lived in by the primary homeowner and rent out the larger house, that the owner of the property needs to live on the property, on the premises. Who they rent the other unit to, whether it be the primary dwelling unit or the accessory dwelling unit, can be, rented like you would do any rental. It does limit, prevent, the state bill would prevent short-term, being used for short-term rentals like Airbnb, for example. I don't know if anyone else had any other thoughts about how this one is written that you think is particularly helpful for the seniors in our community.
I'd like to just jump on and answering part of that question, Assemblymember. This is Alex Lawson from CMI Fair Housing. And one of the really important things that's in Assemblymember Epstein's bill is that it specifies that accessory dwelling units are subject to New York State's human rights law. If a community were to require ADUs to be owned by the person who lives in the primary dwelling unit, then because there's a strange loophole in the way that it's written, that they would be exempt from human rights law, which is the law that says that you can't discriminate on the basis of things like race, religion, sex, age, that kind of a thing. And so it's really, if someone were to say that they wanted to just put the ADU on the open market, a really important part of this law is that it would then be fair housing. It was not a way that you could, you couldn't build an ADU and then maintain segregation in a community. It would have to be open to everybody. And that's a very strong part of their bill.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. Here is another question. To what extent does creating a set of pre-approved ADU designs like the Santa Fe model help push through support of ADU legislation as well as creating market efficiencies? And I'll let Kristen, Samar, or Marcel, if you would like to.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. To what extent does creating a set of pre-approved ADU designs like the Santa Fe model help push through support of ADU legislation as well as creating market efficiencies?
I mean, while it will help that, but then you are also restricting the design and making sure that if a person wants to, build something else, they are not allowed to do it. If it's only these are the pre-approved design that can be built. So, for example, going through a pre-approved design means if garage ADUs are not allowed, then you're basically restricting that only these pre-approved designs can be, used for ADUs. So, while it may be efficient for permit purposes, but then you're also sort of restricting someone's designs ideas in terms of ADUs.
Absolutely. I have heard from, and I think I recall reading some legislation or some feedback that it does help move legislation through in places where there are fears and concerns, particularly if it is sort of feels like an unknown foreign thing. But it then does actually limit the amount of ADUs that are built. Because sometimes the designs that are put in place are outside the cost budget for many people. So in particular, it tends to limit the ADUs for low and medium income households in particular. And so it can be, it can exacerbate equity issues. So those are some of the things that I have heard. But thank you, absolutely, Samar. So another question that we have, are the panelists aware of alternative private financing mechanisms? I've seen unique approaches where third-party finance and manage conversion of garages that requires little equity from the homeowner, but supports the development based on future cash flow. Have you seen this be a model? I know, Alex, you're in this area specifically. I don't know if you've seen that, or Kristen, you've seen that across the country.
That's definitely something that's come up in, I think that's bigger in California, and that sort of speaks to the benefits of having a statewide system where firms can sort of specialize in something specific, like, oh, we're going to manage ADUs, but because they're working in a statewide context, there's enough a market there for them to actually pull it off. And that, yeah, it sort of takes the, there's a lot of benefits to a homeowner to be able to have that extra cash flow, but a lot of people don't want to become landlords. It's a lot of extra effort. It's a lot of hassle to deal with. And so this is an interesting option for being able to have the advantages of getting the extra equity, but not having the hassle of actually having to deal with it. And I'll just say that personally, this idea of using the equity from ADUs to help with homeownership matters a lot to me personally. I live in Syracuse. I live near the university, and I think it's probably a similar market to what you have in Ithaca, where it can be difficult to buy a one-family home because there are a lot of landlords who would prefer to buy it to rent out by the room, and so they are getting their financing based on that expected income. Whereas me and my wife, who are looking right now, don't have the same kind of options. And so the models like what the question was talking about are really empowering for individuals who are just trying to buy a home to be able to break into a market in a place that does have these pressures from just a lot of people wanting to live there.
Thank you, Alex. And it's always good to bring in our personal experiences as well, so that we have sort of a visceral connection to each other. And so thank you. I do, Marcel, would love for you to have a moment to elaborate. Reading your comment, you did a recent analysis of the metro area market, which concluded that ADUs will be relevant in addressing the imbalances exacerbated during COVID. Can you speak a little bit to that? And thank you for this link.
The link has some of the details, but we did an analysis of the appreciation rates of housing in the metro area and did a comparison of the past decade from 2010 to 2020, and then a comparison against the post-pandemic or the ongoing trends. And we could see that there's a correlation in terms of housing undersupply, or the rate of new permits that are being made available at the county level, with how quickly those appreciation rates are increasing, making our housing stock generally more expensive. And so I think that has to do a little bit with the question that was made earlier about how ADUs are relevant in terms of the overall housing market. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but.
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean, here in the community, we have talked a lot about equity and the affordability of these, as long as it's done in a way that truly does help the inequities that exist in housing. So this is really important. And I want to move to a question that another participant asked, which I think is very important to address. How is parking impacted by these dwellings? Ithaca has strict parking requirements on residential dwellings. I just want to note this bill does require that there is on-street parking, it does not require additional off-street parking. In fact, it says that you cannot require additional off-street parking, but it does specifically talk about on-street parking unless there is at least one public transportation stop within a half a mile of the dwelling. So, it does go hand in hand with us needing to continue to improve our public transit systems. But, this is always a concern. So I know, Marcel, you spoke briefly about it. I think, Kristen, you did as well. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. And Samar, I think you might have as well. I can't remember who mentioned it. So please, anyone who has a thought on this.
Yeah, I'll say, the bill does make exceptions, especially if you live in a neighborhood where there is not available on-street parking 24 hours a day, every day a year. But I think that, to Samar's earlier point when talking about kind of these prefabricated models, anything that restricts the approval of accessory dwelling units is really inhibiting the kind of intergenerational communities that we're trying to build. And I think we have in the ABCs of ADUs that Samar had spoken about a bit earlier, and Samar, I'm sure you'll jump in here. But we've seen in other places where these ADUs have been made legal, that it may be added, like if we look at Portland, Oregon, for example, I think it added 1 additional car for every 6 city blocks. So the concerns about parking, I think, are not quite as dire as they may be when we see the actual take-up rate and how this plays out in other places that have implemented accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, I would add before, I know Samar, you have amazing input on this. I did a little bit of research on the areas that have added ordinances allowing or requiring ADUs based on criteria as of right. And what I saw was less than a 1% increase in housing units per year after the ADU was put into place. This was in particular in California. So I bring that up only because there is, whenever these are created and it's as of right, there is a sort of this fear that it's going to be this massive instantaneous overnight explosion. And allowing something is different, than it just occurring overnight, because they still are expensive. So it's a handful of people who will be able to invest. I'm glad that the state is looking at a grant program to be added to this to allow for low and medium income people to also participate. But it is still a lift. So I want to put that in context. And Samar, please, I would love to hear your input.
Thank you so much. Assemblymember, you just actually talked about exactly what I was going to talk about, which is, there's a huge concern that suddenly you'll get up in the morning and there are ADUs everywhere. It doesn't happen like that. It doesn't. Sun will rise in the east and will set in the west. It will be the same day next day. It's not going to be ADUs everywhere, and there's the entire NIMBY crowd. They're just scared that they'll be surrounded by ADUs, but that's not going to happen. Even if you see the progress that has happened in the country, it's still a new concept, right? So you still you cannot have a judgment on saying ADUs are good or bad. It's just a good housing option. And we have seen that with the research. And with research, going forward, I think it's going to prove to be a good housing options for all ages and for all income types. Just to answer the other question, which Kristen was talking about parking. Before that, I did put something in the chat. I'm using an iPad, so I couldn't format it properly, but I gave a non-exhaustive list of ADU financing programs of examples in different parts of the country, which are good ADU financing programs. Anyway, going back to the parking issue, as Kristen was saying, that parking is something that, to be honest, AARP does not mandate. I mean, we do not mandate for, and we do not advocate for we should have parking requirements. The reason is that, first of all, parking is expensive. And secondly, we should just let the owner of the property decide whether they need parking or not. And that's the reason I like this legislation, because they provide you an option saying, if you are near a transit, parking is not mandated. But if a owner or the property owner is building an ADU and wants parking, let them do it on their accord, because they think that they require parking for some reason or the other. Instead of mandating parking or not mandating parking, I think it should be, again, property rights is something that's important, and let the property owner decide whether they need parking or not. That's just my thought.
Yeah, and there's something else. There was a study that was done by the Downtown Ithaca Alliance here in Ithaca a handful of years ago that I really appreciated. And it was sort of flipping the conversation on its head. Everybody that I talk to wants a small scale, quaint, neighborhood that's got, the coffee shop on the street corner and restaurants, and you can kind of walk everywhere, but it feels sort of cozy and alive. And the question they were asking is, well, what kind of density would you need in order to support those businesses that are the neighborhood businesses? And what they found in Ithaca is that for the downtown business district, They went out a half a mile and they said, do we have the density to support these businesses to create the foot traffic? And we didn't. And then, they went out a mile and they kept going out in concentric circles, and they found that they needed 25 miles out in order to capture the amount of people to create the foot traffic for these small scale, mom and pop stores that we have. And so, we have to think, what is it that we need? How many people do we need to create that neighborhood? And what type of development do we want? So this is sort of a win-win. You're creating that kind of small scale development that retains the character of the neighborhood. You create homeowner options, and then you create enough density to support those local small scale businesses to prevent them from being taken over by the Amazons of the world. So that the question is, what is that balance? And there was also research that shows that, you have enough density, it supports public transit, and then you have enough public transit, it reduces dependency on cars, and then there are fewer people that are leaning on their cars. And so there's been a transition or sort of a move away, for example, of needing the 2-car household, right? There's sort of a down to a 1-car household. Some are 0-car households. And yet we still have the antiquated minimum 2-car off-street parking requirement, right, per unit of housing. Which just continues to push on a very car-centric community, even if we don't actually still need them. So the conversation of what it is that we need and what it is that we want really needs to happen. So anyway, thank you so much. And Alex, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to add sort of an upstate perspective, because I think when you talk about statewide stuff, especially transportation, it's easy to think about like, oh, well, New York City, they've got such good public transportation, you don't need a car there. But the fact of the matter is that in upstate cities like in Ithaca and in Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, these smaller cities, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 households don't own cars already. This isn't like a future we're trying to get to. This is the reality for a lot of people who already live in our communities. And in this context of ADU specifically, when you look at just 1-person households, which is what primarily you'd be having in ADUs, the percentages are much higher. So the impact on parking is the stat that Kristen gave didn't surprise me at all, that it has such a small impact on how many cars are added, because the fact of the matter is that our urban communities are already pretty good places to live without a car, and 1-person households are already getting by without a car pretty well.
Right. And most smaller municipalities still have sort of the antiquated minimum of 2-car off-street parking requirements. But, that came from a time when, the car industry had a very, very strong influence on zoning across the country. And I think that does need to be reevaluated. How many are actually being used? How many are necessary? And someone did point out that Ithaca does not allow for homeowners to decide on parking on their property. And creating more flexibility may be something that we need to look at, but also noting that Ithaca is hilly, and for an aging population, they do need to be able to have cars and parking for their cars in order to get around this town. But if we allow for that flexibility, then those who don't need it might not take up the space to allow for those that do. So what is that balance that we need is certainly a conversation that we need to have. So I really appreciate the question.
Just one last data point on that flexibility piece, Assemblymember. It reminds, I recently attended a lecture on public parking, and you're very right, like neighborhood by neighborhood in this community, I think it matters quite a bit. Something like when the mandatory parking minimums for College Town were relaxed, something like 20% of the parking that should have been required was actually built to meet needs. And that space that would otherwise have been, occupied by vehicles that could be used for homes, businesses, pedestrian walkway, like anything.
Well, it could be used absolutely for businesses and more homes, and the more units they can put in, the more affordable they can be, right? We restrict the number of units in per building, it will automatically increase the cost per unit. So, I'm a data wonk. I really appreciate the data. So thank you so much. And I want to, we've gone 20 minutes over. But we ended on such an important topic, and I really deeply appreciate that we were able to get the conversation in about parking. I want to thank every single one of you for taking time out of your day for educating us on what you're doing nationally, the data of what's happening in the state. You all are inspiration for me in a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is affordable housing, making sure everyone has a place to live for their entire life. So thank you. And I will I'm going to keep track of the chat, so people can reach out to my office if they weren't able to get some of these links. Happy to share them. So Kristen, Samar, Marcel, Robert, and Alex, thank you, thank you, thank you. And this is recorded, so we're happy to share it with you all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.